It is a pleasure to welcome you today to this webinar. My name is Astrid Van Mierlo. I'm the head of unit of TaxUD C5. So our unit is dealing in particular with topics related to the methodology and scope and economic analysis of CBAM. Today is the second webinar in a wider series of 6 webinars. And please take note that upcoming seminars will touch upon certificates, declaration, carbon prices paid in a third country, and downstream extension. During the first webinar, which took place in March, we presented a bigger picture of CBAM, focusing on emission calculation and on accreditation and verification. The recording and related materials are to be found on the CBAM website for all of you to have a look at. One of the main elements of emission calculation is obviously calculating the embedded emissions. CBAM importers have to decide whether embedded emission will be based on actual values or on default values. CBAM, as you know, included a transitional period, and since 1st January 2026, we have entered the definitive period. To accompany this transition, a package of implementing legislation setting out the rules for the definitive period was published in December 2025. This included, among others, and of particular relevance today, the Implementing Act laying out the new methodology to calculate emissions based on actual values, which we will refer to as the methodology throughout this webinar. The main goal of today's webinar is to cover the methodology by focusing on the changes compared to the transitional period. We hope you will find it useful and interesting, and I already take the opportunity to thank my colleagues who will present it. Now I will give the floor to Sophia for the agenda and housekeeping rules. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Astrid, and welcome everyone. My name is Sofia Rosanelli, and I work in Unit C2 of DG TaxUD, working specifically on CBAM implementation. Today, I will be your moderator, and first of all, I would like again to thank you for your participation. Today, we have received more than 4,500 registered participants, and we're very happy to see such a high engagement. Let's start with a very brief overview of where most of our audience comes from. As you can see from the slide, most of our participants are based in the EU. We're talking about 62.6% of the total of participants, while 37.4% are based outside of the EU. And if we have a look at the top 10 countries, we can see that the highest share is connecting today from Turkey, followed by Germany, Spain, Italy, Belgium, France, the UK, Netherlands, China, and Poland. Now, before we start, I would like to walk you through some very brief housekeeping rules. First of all, thank you so much for those of you who have submitted questions during your registration. We have gathered all the questions and we have done our best to select the ones that are more common but also more relevant to the scope of today's webinar. And for the Q&A, we will have a dedicated section at the very end of the presentation that will be held by my colleagues. After the webinar, as already mentioned by Astrid, we will share the webinar recording, the key takeaways, and also a satisfaction survey. The material will be available on the CBAM website. As you might have noticed, we're currently undergoing a restructuring of our website, and the material will be available in the communication and FAQs section. But also for registered participants, all those materials will be shared via an email. Now, let's go through the agenda. We will start with a brief introduction, setting the scene, explaining why methodology is important specifically for third country operators. We will then dive deep into the methodology and touch upon the topics that you see on the slide. So we're going to touch upon functional unit, production processes, system boundaries, indirect emissions, emissions from precursors, and finally, monitoring plan and operators emissions report. And lastly, we will have the dedicated section about the Q&A. Lastly, I would like to inform participants that we're streaming. As you know, there might be a slight delay between the sound and the slides, but we're going to try our best to coordinate, of course. Now, time to start. And I will give the floor to Ivana.
Thank you, Sofia, and good afternoon again to everybody. My name is Ivana Hotskova. I am working in the C2 unit, responsible for the team for the implementation of the CBAM, directly practically in the CBAM registry, and also working very closely with Sofia and our sister unit with Astrid that are dealing with more methodology aspects. So why we organized this webinar? Because we we understand that it's very, very important for those third countries and those operators and producers and exporters who have their CBAM goods with least carbon emissions and they did their decarbonization efforts, how they can prove it, how they can show it and use it as a competitive advantage. Because it is a core of a CBAM where we would like to see reporting on actual emissions. The methodology is quite complex, but don't worry, we will break it down for you. And hopefully, after this webinar, it will be much clearer. Why it is very important to understand the methodology right now? Because in 2026, it's the first year where the emissions, when they are really happening as we speak, they are going to be measured, monitored, recorded, and later on, they will be reported by the declarants in their annual CBAM declarations. We are not starting from scratch. We have been already in the transitional period since 2023. We were seeing a lot of reports and a lot of actual emissions reported. And I'm very happy that we saw also in the registrations of this webinar that we have third country producers joining us from all continents, or basically almost all continents. So I hope you will find that useful. We saw that already some of you are registered in what we called third countries operator portal as a part of the CBAM registry. The CBAM registry is the tool or the interface that we will be using, all of us, to communicate on the CBAM. We have been already using it in transitional period, and a lot of you already know it. There are slight changes in the methodology, and that we will really touch upon that later. What is also important to underline is that all of you who are producers are free to join the registry and use full advantages of sharing your confidential, important, sensitive emission data with those importers who are relevant for you. So the registry is equipped with very high protective features to safeguard your data, and you are able to share the relevant information with the selected importers. And like that, the information can flow very easily and seemingly between importers, operators, and their verifiers. We are all preparing for the big declaration year in 2027, and already since 1st of January 2025, the producers have possibility to join the registry, and we are very happy that we already had more than 1,000 requests to join the EU login, and already more than 200 are approved and registered in the third country operator portal. That to underline, we still have a lot of rejections for incomplete applications. Please feel free to amend and to send additional data, and like that, your data will be already in the registry and you can use it. As I said, this is an advantage for those who are registered. If you are not registered or you're still hesitating, there is always a possibility to share information later on outside, but then the full emission report and full emission data would need to be disclosed. But this brings me to another stage of the process. What the operators should know right now in 2026, what are the most important and key things and key takeaways that we will go into details later on, is that right now all of you hopefully already have your monitoring plan. For those who don't have it yet in English, please be careful with the translations. Be careful that the monitoring plan is updated and that really it represents physical and production reality. You would be requested, and soon we will provide a template, we call it full emission report. We call it communication template. Some of you already know it from transitional period. There will be soon an update of it that fully corresponds to the new methodology. What is important is that you know very well what are your installation boundaries, system boundaries, and you monitor your direct indirect emissions within those boundaries. Another thing very important is that you map your entire value chain, your supplier chain. If it happens that one of or more of your precursors, and we had also received a lot of questions to that, happen to be CBAM goods, in order to use the actual real emissions, those precursors from the suppliers, they also would need to be supported by verification report and reported on actuals if you want to avoid use of default values. And why it is really, really beneficial? Because later, with a deadline of 30 of September 2027, your importers or your declarants will be able to submit and profit from the declaration with much lower values, much lower CBAM cost. And of course, that gives you a real competitive advantage on the international stage. And as I speak about that right now, why so? Because it's true that the use of the actual emissions requires use of the verification report as well. The verification is only going to happen later in 26 or early 27 or only in 27. And it is a prerequisite for whoever wants to profit in and submit a declaration. It's not only actual emissions that have to be reported, they have to be supported by the verification report. So it would be very useful if you already map not only who your suppliers are, but who can come and verify. First year, it is required also physical visit to visit your installation, and that whatever number you're going to put in the full emission report, you know exactly where this number came from, who did the measurement, who did verify the measurement, that you have created a quality assurance, quality control within your installation to ensure that also if there are any changes to the methodology or the values, they are fully supported by at least 4I principle. So what we can suggest to you and say like a best practice, while you are doing reporting of actual emissions and measuring it, prepare your verification file to be ready to understand how the numbers are generated, controlled, how they were reviewed, who approved them, and how can you support every number with an evidence. So I wish you really good luck in this, and I'll leave you now with the hands of my colleagues who will go more into technical details to really explore you the beauty and mystery of the methodology.
Thank you, Ivana. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rocío Rodríguez, and I'm part of the TACSUD CBAM team. And I'm going to be one of the colleagues in the CBAM team that will explain you the beauties, as Ivana said, of the methodology. But today, in particular, we are going to focus on the key changes that the methodology for the definitive period has introduced compared to the transitional methodology, since these are the sources of most of the questions and doubts that we are receiving. So the idea is that during this webinar, we will explain these changes together with examples, as this is the best way to show the practical implementation of these new elements. But of course, apart from this webinar, you will also have more details and more explanations in the updated guidance document for operators that will be published soon. And this will not be the only guidance. Apart from this one, you will also have guidance document focused on verification and accreditation. At the beginning of the webinar, you also have already available the recording from the previous webinar that was dedicated to verification and accreditation and also to free allocation methodology. Well, this slide is quite important. It's dedicated to a new element, which is the functional unit. Ivana has already mentioned it before. And this particular concept has sparked many doubts and questions, so we really need to stop and explain this in detail. As it is defined in the implementing regulation, the functional unit is the reference unit 2 that is used to calculate embedded emissions of goods. And this concept was introduced to address an issue of comparability that was coming from the transitional methodology. As you may remember, I mean, those that are familiar with the transitional methodology, there was this concept of aggregated goods category, which determined the production process. So therefore, all goods that were within the aggregated goods category, the result was that all of them had the same specific embedded emissions, since all came from the same production process. However, within this aggregated goods category, you find heterogeneous goods, not only in terms of characteristics, but also in terms of embedded emissions. And at the same time, the transitional methodology gave the flexibility to define further the levels of disaggregation. These two elements, the aggregated goods category and the flexibility to define further the disaggregation within the aggregated goods category, created some comparability issues as the product categories were not defined to allow comparability between goods produced by different installations, because those goods would be defined in many different ways as the operator would choose. And from this issue, the concept of the functional unit, some of you may recognize it as a concept coming from life cycle assessment and carbon footprint. So we introduced this functional unit, we adapted to CBAM in a way that the functional unit cover all goods within a common category. And in the case of CBAM, this common category is established as the 8-digit CN codes. Since they are a good descriptor of goods in terms of function, quality, and performance. Okay, CN codes may be not perfect in all cases, but they are sufficient and appropriate for CBAM purposes. So the general rule is that the functional unit is defined as tons of goods within the same CN code. But there are some special cases where first, electricity for obvious reason, for sure. I mean, you have to measure it in kilowatt hours. But apart from that, we have also the cases of cement and fertilizers whose function, quality, and performance are strongly correlated to the content of certain elements. The clinker content in the case of cement and the nitrogen content in the case of fertilizers. And the composition of these components can vary in a significant range for cement products and fertilizer products. So for this reason, the functional unit is defined as the content of clinker in the case of cement and the content of nitrogen in the case of fertilizers. In practice, what this means for you. So the functional unit is a reference unit to measure the production of each production process, or the delivery of each production process. So in other words, it is the unit to measure the activity level of the production process. Since the CN codes define the production process, the functional unit defines a production process, there cannot be more processes than CN codes are produced in an installation. And then the third consequence is that the disaggregation per production route that was allowed in the transitional methodology is no longer allowed, because the functional unit is by its own definition defined by function, quality, and performance of a category of products. So if we add the disaggregation per production route, that would entail an additional definition, a duplication of the functional unit, an additional definition based on criteria that has no relation to function, quality, and performance. That is the core of the definition of the functional unit. In this slide, what we want to show is a bit more in detail these special functional units that are linked to cement and fertilizers, how to be monitored in a cement plant or a fertilizer plant that produces goods with different compositions. As I said before, the clinker content, the tons of clinker content in the cement goods is now the functional unit. That means that the installation operator has to monitor the clinker to cement ratio to know the clinker contained in the production. And this will be the functional unit. And that means that the emissions of the production process are attributed to these tons of clinker in the cement produced in the installation. So this way, the embedded emissions are linked to the specific component that provides both the quality and the performance characteristics of the cement, and also is very much correlated to the embedded emissions of cement, because as you may know, the clinker is actually the precursors which contributes more to the specific embedded emissions of cement. And similarly for fertilizer, the operator needs to monitor the total nitrogen content of the fertilizers within a CN code and attribute these emissions to this functional unit, to the nitrogen content. And the same, once you have the specific embedded emissions per kilograms of nitrogen, when you have different products with different composition, it's a matter of multiplying the specific embedded emission by the different contents of nitrogen of the different compositions. So that's, they say, the beauty. In this case, I'm going to use this word because I think it fits well with CBAM. Now I would like to explain, because you may have seen in the implementing regulation, in the article that is specifically dedicated to functional unit, that there is, in the case of fertilizers, a distinction for certain CN codes applying kilograms of nitrogen and other CN codes applying something that is indicated as supplementary unit. This is because most fertilizers that are in Chapter 31 of the Combined Nomenclature regulation have a supplementary unit that is specified as kilograms of nitrogen. So this is something, since it's a supplementary unit within the combined nomenclature, this is a unit, the kilograms of nitrogen is something that the importers have to declare at customs. In those cases, to make use of the declaration in customs, the functional unit is expressed as supplementary unit, but only for those that have this in the combined nomenclature. However, there are some fertilizers in the chapter 31 that do not have supplementary unit, but also the chemicals in chapter 28, which are precursors of fertilizers such as ammonia, they don't have also supplementary units. So what we did is simply is to distinguish them and assign the functional unit in the same terms as the supplementary unit, but without naming supplementary unit because there are not. So for them, the functional unit is kilograms of nitrogen. But the result is that all fertilizer products have the same function. Now that I have finished with the functional unit, which is a bit complex to explain, another we stop a bit before the production process that is also a bit, let's say, tricky, just to something is lighter, which is the change that you may have seen in the methodology about the reporting period. As you may remember, in the transitional period, the calendar year was the reporting period, but there were other options that could be used if justified. Then the declarant had to report quarterly their imports, but the specific embedded emissions were based on a reporting year that was usually the calendar year. Now, in the definitive period, this is changed a bit. So the calendar year is used as a fixed reporting period, so we don't allow those different options. It's the calendar year. And also we have this, let's say, two situations because of the initiation of the definitive period. So if a good is imported during the year 2026, then the reporting period has to be the year 2026. I mean, there is no other option. This is because there is no verification before this year. But then afterwards, I mean, 27 onwards, the reporting period is by default the calendar year during which the good was imported, but there is the option also, if there is sufficient evidence to identify the actual time of production, then the reporting period can be that year, let's say, but by default it's always the calendar year where the goods were imported. If proof can be provided, then the actual year of production. So now we are going to speak about the production process. This concept is not new. I mean, was already part of the transitional period. Actually, it's a key element to understand the methodology. Probably some people that think that the methodology is a bit complicated or difficult to grasp is because they don't have clear the concept of the production process. So we are going now to explain the difference between the transitional and the definitive period, which are quite important. And I hope that with this explanation, those that were a bit lost in the transitional methodology will understand it, and also you will understand the changes in the definitive period. So I already introduced this a bit with the functional unit because it's very much related. In the transitional period, as I said, the aggregated goods category defined the production process by default, but they could be disaggregated more into other production lines. There was also this rule that if there were different production routes, also the disaggregation per production route of the production process. I don't explain again, this brought comparability issues, as I said before. And this is basically mainly the main difference between the transitional methodology and the definitive one, which is that the production process is no longer defined by the aggregated goods category. We don't allow the flexibility that the operator can choose another disaggregation level or a production line, but there is a fixed aggregation level or disaggregation level, depending where you are seeing. So which is the functional unit, which at the end is defined by the CN code. Just a note for later is that the aggregated goods category is no longer used to define the production process, right? But this is still retained in the definitive methodology for the purpose of system boundaries, but my colleague Julie will explain this later. This is one change, production process linked to CN codes, but apart from this change is also accompanied by other rules that allow the recognition of that the fact that some production process can deliver different types of goods in terms of CN code. And you may have seen it already in the definitive period, which is the multifunctional process. So multifunctional process, together with some rules that require the grouping of CN codes under certain circumstances. This is something that is basically the core change of the definitive methodology in terms of production process compared to the transition. Now, next slide, please. I think this will be much better understood with the first example of the webinar, which is a schematic diagram of the production processes involved in the steel goods. And I think that is what all that I've said, probably it will be much easier to see in this diagram. So this is, as you see, is a complete diagram which covers from the production of sinter ore to the manufacture of tubes and all the different intermediate steps that are between the two. It also covers the production of ferroalloys and also the situation where waste gases are used to produce electricity. As you can see also in the middle of the diagram, this is important. You have the production process 3, which is the one that delivers crude steel. The production process is defined by the delivered good in terms of CN code. So crude steel has a specific CN code if it's produced in primary forms, let's say ingots, slabs, etc. So that goods is linked to the production process 3, and the production process 3 is covering both production routes that happen in the installation, okay? Both the primary and also the secondary production route through electrical furnace. So this is basically one example of how this not allowing production route disaggregation would work in this example. Repeating again, the key thing that you need to understand is that the production process, as you see, are defined by the goods that are delivered, and that those goods are all within the same CN codes. We will speak again later on with this example also about how to group CN codes, because there are rules for that. But golden rule to remember is that the goods produced in an installation are to be grouped under a CN code and then identify the production process. There can never be more production process than CN codes. There can be less, that for sure. Probably that's most situations are like that, but never more. So now, I mean, we are going just to refresh the memories of those that are familiar with the transitional methodology, because we are going to speak just about the bubble approach, that this was the term to refer to what in the definitive methodology is established in Article 4, that is the possibility to create a joint production process that also include intermediate products or precursors. So basically, Article 4 says that where precursors relevant for complex goods are produced in the same installation as the complex goods, and where the respective precursors are not transferred out for sale or use in other production process, then the production of precursors and complex goods may be covered by a joint production process. And this is good because then the monitoring is only on one production process. So this is again a lot of words, but it's much easier to see in the diagram. So basically, what this rule means is that, for example, if crude steel that is was produced in production process in the previous slide is all used in the hot rolling process, so it's not sold outside of the installation or used in another production process, both production processes can be, let's say, put together in one single production process that covers the production of crude steel and the final good that would be the semis hot roll. So that would be the idea put in practice, and this can be extended as much as it can be, I mean, depending on the situation of the installation. I mean, for example, if we continue a bit upstream, if all the pig iron that is produced in production process 3 is consumed in the production process from 2 to 3, so then production process 2 and 3 could be put together in only one production process. So then the emissions of that production process would be all attributed to the end final product of that production process. I think is more or less clear. This is something quite new, which is the concept of multifunctional process, and in a way replaces the concept of aggregated goods category. So instead of this, the rule of the aggregated goods category, that was like a one-fits-all rule common to any installation, the definitive methodology provides rules for grouping CN codes for two reasons mainly: to simplify the monitoring and calculation, but also to improve certain details in the descriptors of the CN codes that may not fit completely to the needs of CBAM. This is written in Article 4.8. So it says that where goods to which different functional units apply are produced through the same processes, the operator may determine a single multifunctional production process. In that case, attribution rules, in accordance to blah, 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 okay, something in the annex, are to be applied. In situations specified in point A4 of that annex, we will go later there, then the determination of a single multifunctional production process shall be mandatory. So let's start with the possibility, with the may part of the article. So the operator can group the CN codes. This is not a requirement. So the implementation of this article gives leeway to adapt to the reality of the installation, but of course it requires a bit of help for this interpretation. So we provide some recommendations. You will also find it in the guidance document, that we can already explain it here. And these recommendations are particularly for iron and steel products, where this rule it may be more difficult to apply. So we recommend that there is a first level of grouping. So the production processes of goods whose CN codes share the same range in composition of ferroalloys are grouped. Okay, so we always have to look to the CN code, because at the end this is what defines the product. Okay, every time that the methodology speaks about the type of precursor goods in general, it's always talking about CN codes. So the second level of grouping would be CN codes that are made of the same material, let's say non-alloy steel, stainless steel, that those can be also grouped. And there is a third level of grouping. Remember that these are all recommendations, because this is a possibility of the operator to do. I mean, this is not a requirement. And a third level of grouping, that it would be grouping production process do not have very relevant emissions. So, with examples, because this again is a bit difficult to explain, and it's much easier to understand with something tangible. I mean, this is the typical issue when writing methodologies that need to be adaptable and used in too many situations, that at the end you get a wording that is a bit abstract. So applied to our diagram, this would mean that the first level of grouping, so remember the production processes of goods whose CN codes share the same range in composition. This would mean that all CN codes produced in the installation that are hot roll products and have the same range of nickel content could be grouped. Okay, so then production process 3, as you see in the slide, that will be hot rolling, will be a multifunctional process covering all the CN codes that you see there. Then the second level, which, as you remember, is grouping CN codes made of the same material. So grouping CN codes under, for example, the 73 chapter made of stainless steel in this part. So this means that production process 7 would be a multifunctional process covering all the CN codes at the list that are within the 73 chapter that are made of stainless steel. And then the third level, which we say that this could be grouping processes with no significant emissions. Basically, this would mean in the example that you would take the hot rolling process and the finishing processes, put it together because they are using the same precursor to produce their product, and then the goods of those two processes would be also grouped. Okay, and then it would be a big production process, 5 and 7 together, with all the CN codes that you see in the chapter. Okay, you here see, and in the third level, you here can see that this is a simplification, clearly, because the emissions from hot rolling and finishing, in this case, for example, coating or similar processes, would all be attributed equally to all products, independently of which of the both process they have gone through. Again, I mean, it's not fully correct, but sometimes the simplification, for simplification, you need to sacrifice a bit of accuracy. So this would be the case in this particular situation. As said, this is only a recommendation. So it's for, let's say, give tools, to give tools to the operators to simplify as much as possible the monitoring within the installation. So we have seen now these ways to group production process and to group CN codes. But what we have found from the feedback received and from the questions received is actually that there is a lot of interest on the other part of this article, that is the mandatory requirement. And in general, there is an interest to disaggregate as much as possible. So probably all these recommendations may not be used, but okay, we provide them. So we are going now to see the rule of the mandatory grouping. This rule says that for the goods under the aggregated goods category, crude steel, iron and steel products, and wrought aluminum and aluminum products, where different functional units only differ in size or shape and are produced with the same the same precursors in types, quantities, and proportion, a single multifunctional production process shall be defined. For the aggregated goods category fertilizers, where different functional units are produced with the same precursor in types, quantities, and proportions, and are composed by the same substance and only differ in concentration, then the same. They shall be grouped in a single multifunctional process. And you may think, I mean, why this rule? Why this mandatory rule? Here, the issue here is that we needed to fix certain mismatch between the CN code descriptors and the CBAM methodology. Since there are some goods within the CN codes, I mean, that only differ in the final steps. In the case of metals, finishing processes which are out of the system boundaries. And in the case of fertilizers, there were differences just in concentration when they are marketed in solutions. So this is why we needed to polish, let's say, these descriptors in the CN codes that allowed the definition of production process in a way that was not fit for purpose of CBAM. So if we focus a bit more on this rule on metals, because this may be the least clear, I think that for fertilizer, concentration of substances is I think it's clear. The rule for fertilizers is something that at least we haven't received so many questions, and one can see clearly when you see different concentration and solutions in CN codes how to group. But for metals, it's a bit difficult. 3 questions basically to answer, and this needs to be done ad hoc. So basically, we have the first question: functional units that only differ in shape and size. So basically, you take the CN code description and see if the CN codes differ in shape or size. Are produced with the same precursors in type. Remember, when we say type, we say CN codes. Do they have the same precursors in terms of CN codes? And then when we say same precursors in quantities and proportions, basically is that the different CN codes contain the precursors in the same ranges, are defined in the same ranges. So we have put here this as a bit of applying these 3 criteria to examples, as you see, a bit of a decision tree, in which we have to answer these 3 questions. So in the first example, we have 2 different CN codes, right and left. Sorry that I didn't put the CN code number, but you believe me, these are different real cases of different CN codes. So there are bars and rods above 8, with a section about 80 millimeters, with a content of nickel above 2.5. And another CN code which only differ in the section which is below 80 millimeters. So if you ask the questions, only differ in shape and size? Yes. They have the same CN codes of precursors? Yes, because at the end is ferronickel, ferronickel, same. Have the same quantities and proportions? Yes, at least the CN codes are there as they are described in the combined nomenclature. The range is the same, above 2.5 nickel. So, and this is what they share. Is yes to all of the 3 questions, then they shall be grouped. The second example, in this case, it would be a bit different. So we have a stainless steel wire containing a very specific, I will not read, but a very specific composition of chromium and nickel. And then we have another CN code, which are stainless steel bars and rods with a composition of nickel that is above 2.5. But the installation operator knows that this is exactly the same material, basically that actually these bars and rods have exactly the same composition that the wire. They have, it's not, I mean, there is not a CN code for those bars and rods for some reason. This is why we are introducing these rules, because there are some things in the CN codes that do not fit completely well. So in this case, the installation operators know that this is the same material, okay, that contains this composition of nickel and this composition of chromium. So in that case, only differ in shape and size, yes. Same CN codes of precursors, yes. Same quantities and ranges of precursor, yes. So grouped. And then the third one, example, just to show some moment that you don't have to group. Okay, there is a CN code that is flat roll produce in shape whatever, A. Okay, you will find very specific shapes in the CN codes with content of 2.5 of nickel. But this content of nickel corresponds to a very specific steel grade, okay? And then there is flat rolled products with another shape, which is more than 25 nickel. But the installation operator knows that this product contains nickel in a range for another steel grade, different from shape A. So different in shapes and size, yes, we say that. Same CN codes of precursors, yes, because we are talking again about nickel. But do they have same quantities and proportions? Not, because we are already saying that the nickel contained, I mean, is significantly different, because more than 2.5 nickel can be many things, no? In this case, but as you see, I mean, with this example, so sorry, and I finish, not grouping. But as you see here in the example, is something, is a rule that needs to be applied case by case in each installation operator. But it's quite important, because it is required to fix this mismatch in the CN codes, and we have received many questions about it. So this would be the last from my side, and I will give the floor to my colleague Julie.
Thank you. So I'm Julie. I'm also working in DigiTaxud in the CBAM team. So now that we saw with Rocio first how functional units are to be defined for each CBAM good, and then how production processes are to be identified, we can move to the next step, identifying the system boundary for each production process. So the general rule is that for each production process, the system boundary has to cover one, the direct emissions, then indirect emissions from electricity consumption. This is only for goods not listed in Annex 2 to CBAM regulation, but you'll be explained all of that later. And these emissions are the ones emitted by all processes directly or indirectly linked to the production process. Third point is embedded emissions of any precursor that is used in the production process. So whether this precursor is produced on the installation itself or acquired from another installation. The definition of a system boundary in the methodology regulation is a group of chemical or physical processes included in the calculation of embedded emissions of goods under the same aggregated goods category. So you might wonder, how do I know which processes I include on it? So this is why we have sector-specific rules that define which processes to be included or not per aggregated goods category. As Rocio said before, this is where they still enter into the game of the methodology. So per aggregated goods category, you have which processes to include, which to exclude, and also sometimes where relevant with distinctions per production route. And then it's the operator's task to identify the specific processes to include in the system boundary based on these rules. So some in the sector-specific rules, there has been some changes that we want to underline now. So for iron or steel products, the system boundary now explicitly includes reheating, remelting, casting, hot rolling, cold rolling, forging, annealing, coating, galvanizing, wire drawing, and pickling, and specifically excludes plating, cutting, welding, and finishing of iron or steel products. Similarly now, for aluminium products, it explicitly excludes cutting, welding, and finishing of aluminium products. Another big change is that, you might remember that in the transitional methodology, you had a list of relevant precursors per sector, so per aggregated goods category. This is not the case anymore, because now a precursor can be any CBAM good that is used as an input material into the production process. So this is actually the operator's task to identify which input materials are also precursors. Also excluded now are the purchase and maintenance of infrastructure and equipment. To go a bit more in detail, for instance, would be blasting and painting considered as part of finishing and therefore excluded. For iron or steel products, what we consider as finishing is all processes with minor emissions, so negligible energy consumption. Blasting and painting can be considered as such, so as finishing processes, and thus excluded from the system boundary. Another question we received a lot is whether galvanizing is out of the system boundary when it is carried out in another installation. So you might remember from the slide before, but galvanizing is explicitly mentioned as included in the system boundary. So emissions have to be accounted for, whether it occurs in the installation or not. You have to include them, and then you can also decide whether it is in the same production process or if you add a production process specifically for that other installation. And then I'll give the floor to Michael.
Thank you very much. So I will try not to be too mysterious, but I see time is moving on, so to be fast and hopefully still very clear. On indirect emissions, just to give you an overview, first of all, on some general changes that we have between the transitional period and the definitive period. Of course, what we're looking at here in the definition is we're looking at emissions from the production of electricity, which is consumed during the production processes of goods. So that remains the same between the two periods. But in terms of the scope in the transitional period, you needed to report indirect emissions for all CBAM goods, and that is different now because they are only reported for CBAM goods that are not listed in Annex 2 of the CBAM regulation, and that is, of course, cement, fertilizers, but also agglomerated iron ore. Now, when we look at the aggregation of indirect emissions, so this is the case when you have multiple sources of indirect emissions or of electricity. In the transitional period, there was nothing specific on this, but now in the definitive period, we have defined it. So if you have a production installation that receives electricity from multiple sources, so for instance, imagine you have some electricity that comes from the grid, some comes from a power purchasing agreement, a PPA, then you have to get them together using a weighted average of the emission factors of all the sources. So you take, for instance, the emission factor from the grid, and then how much you have consumed from the grid, then the emission factor for the PPA and how much you have consumed through the PPA, and then you take a weighted average to add them up. Now, the last general change is about the evidence that you need to provide when it comes to using actual emissions, so not default values, but actual emissions. We had some general indications before, but now in the definitive period, we have really clear evidence requirements, and we'll go into more detail on those to justify the use of actual data when you calculate indirect emissions. And the emission factor of electricity may then be based on actual data if either a direct connection to the installation is in force, and that can be demonstrated, or a PPA, a power purchase agreement, is in force, and that can be demonstrated. So looking at the next slide, we can then take a closer look at these conditions that have now been clearly defined. And actual emissions may be used actually here in the case of a direct technical link that can be demonstrated, or a power purchase agreement, so the famous PPA. Now, what do we have to show with these elements of evidence? Actually, what we have to cover is that this direct technical link or the PPA exists, but also that it's being used. So these are really the two things that we have to show. Just to be clear, that only physical PPAs are eligible here. So PPAs, it's only the physical ones that are eligible. Now, what specific elements of evidence? For the direct technical link, first of all, it's a single line diagram that proves the existence of this link. For private grids, we also look at a contract between the two installations for the delivery of at least the quantity of electricity that you are reporting actual emissions for. Now, for PPAs, we would start with a contract, so contractual evidence that demonstrates that there is actually the PPA between the producer of the good that is reporting actual emissions and the producer of the electricity. Now, there's one particular case here. If in this contract you don't just have two, the producer and the consumer of the electricity, but you also have an intermediary, what is important is that your contractual evidence demonstrates that only one single contract was concluded between those three contracting parties. So if you have an intermediary, show that there's only one contract between the producer, the consumer, and the intermediary. And the second thing is some written documentation from the TSO, the transmission system operator, or other relevant public authorities that also prove the existence again of a physical grid connection between the two installations where the electricity is produced and consumed. And to finish off on these conditions, there are some common elements as well for both the PPA and the direct technical link. And that is that smart metering data prove that a certain quantity of electricity was actually produced during a given time. And then also data that shows that an equivalent amount of electricity was delivered to the plant that produces the CBAM good during a given time. And this should be within 1 hour of the production. So it's really to match the production and the consumption of the electricity. Now, having looked at all these things that are a bit across the different sectors, we can move on to the next slide, where we have some sector-specific changes that we see from the transitional period to the definitive one. When we look at the sector of iron and steel precursors, here we had in the transitional period the rule that indirect emissions were included for all CBAM relevant precursors, whereas in the definite period now we have aggregated iron ores not being excluded from the indirect emissions requirement. So the indirect emissions for this must still be included for iron and steel goods, even though steel itself has no indirect emissions listed in Annex 2. So steel is out, but if a precursor here is aggregated iron ores, the indirect emissions for the aggregated iron ores, they are need to be reported. Now, in terms of exclusion of indirect emissions, when we look at hydrogen and ammonia, in the transitional period, indirect emissions were included, again, for all CBAM relevant precursors, but in the definite period now, we don't need to report indirect emissions for hydrogen. And this applies also where hydrogen is a precursor to ammonia. So that's very important. Even though for ammonia, indirect emissions are required. So that's mainly it. If you look at the bottom of the slide, you still have a bit of a decision tree or a flow where you would ask, are indirect emissions generally in scope? Then you look at the electricity sources. Especially if you have multiple sources, you would look at the weighted average of emission factors here, but you could also have a single source or a subset only, and then need sufficient evidence, of course, for this and use that in the reporting. So that was it on the indirect emissions, and with that, I won't hand over again.
Thank you. So now that we saw direct emissions, indirect emissions, we have also embedded emissions of precursors. So the main changes, the first one is, I already said that we don't have a list of relevant precursors anymore. Any CBAM good can be a precursor. Then regarding the reporting periods, so the default for a precursor is that it would be the year of production of the complex good. This is also for simplification purposes, unless the operator provides evidence on the actual production year that can then be used for the reporting period of the precursor. So you need to determine this for obvious reasons. For instance, if you want to use country-specific default values, you need the year of the default values. So then there's also specific rules regarding precursors under the same CN code used within an installation. So if you receive precursors from different reporting periods, but that are still all the same CN code, then you have to use a weighted average of embedded emission of this precursor across all reporting periods. Then another case is when you have the same CN code, same precursor, but coming from different suppliers. Same again here, the default rule is to use the weighted average across all suppliers. And here we have again an exemption rule. So if the operator can show that there's only precursors coming from one supplier or a subset of suppliers, and these were used only for a specific production process in the installation, then you can use if it's only one installation, directly the embedded emissions of those precursors, but if it's a subset, then the weighted average from this subset of installation. for this specific production process. So it's a bit confused maybe, so we'll show with an example on the next slides. So here we have an electric arc furnace producing both alloy steel in production process A and stainless steel in production process B. And both are using ferronickel amongst other precursors from 3 different suppliers. So we have 2 options. We could even have more. The default rule, as I explained just before, would be to use the weighted average of embedded emissions across suppliers 1, 2, and 3 for ferronickel. So for both production processes A and B. And then we could imagine a case where there's enough evidence to show that ferronickel from supplier 1 is used exclusively for the production process A. And then we can use embedded emissions from supplier 1 for process A. And by deduction, you can use then the weighted average of embedded emissions of ferronickel across supplier 2 and 3 for production process B. I hope this clarifies a bit. We also have other changes regarding precursors. So first, all precursors that are produced in the EU or in exempted territories and countries, those that are listed in Annex 3 to the CBAM regulation, shall have zero specific embedded emissions. Just also to note on this rule that even though you use those precursors, you'll still need to provide evidence regarding its origin. They have to be verified as part of the verification of the installation producing the complex good. Then another new rule is that you can combine default and actual values. So when actual values are used for the embedded emissions of a complex good, default values can be used for embedded emissions of its precursors. And similarly here, the origin of precursors will have to be verified to use country-specific default values. So as part of the verification again of the installation producing the complex good, which uses this precursor. And then I hand over back to Rocio.
Thank you, Julie. Okay, I will be quick. So, because also, I mean, this is not so difficult to explain compared to the other topics. We have now in the slide the monitoring plan. This is also a new element of the definitive period. As you may remember, in the transitional period, there was only recommendation to have monitoring documentation. And this was together with the voluntary communication template that was provided to support the calculation of embedded emissions, were the tools that were provided by the Commission for the learning process during this transitional period. Of course, there was no verification, so it made sense not to have any formal reporting. But now in the definitive period, the verification is required for the use of actual data. So the monitoring plan becomes really relevant to two reasons. First, because there is a need to translate the methodology, as you see, it could be a bit general and abstract, to the reality of each installation. This is one of the objectives of the monitoring plan. And it's also the bridge between the annual reporting and calculation and the verification, since the monitoring plans will help the verifier also to prepare their site visits and to understand what are the specificities of the installation to be audited. This slide is showing the minimum content of the monitoring plan, but is mostly in response to many questions that we have received from the registered participants, whether we will provide a monitoring plan template, etc. I mean, as you can see, there are different sections in the monitoring plan about the installation and goods produced, the monitoring methodology, the precursors, heat and electricity, the waste gases, control system, and to ensure data quality. There are 22 items, and some of these items, like the number 22, have sub-items. So the message that I want to transmit here is that the minimum content is sufficiently specific and ample to cover all the different situations that the operator may have in the installation. So from our point of view, there is no need to provide any template for the operator to understand what elements are to be covered in the monitoring plan. And also to remind the audience that the template of the monitoring plan in the EU ETS has different purposes. For example, is used for issuing permits by the national authorities, which is something that is not needed in CBAM. Then the other element that we have introduced that is derives from the monitoring plan is the emission report. As said, there was not a formal reporting in the transitional period. So it was just this communication template that also covered the summarized information that was needed for the declarants. Now, in the definitive period, the emission report becomes a key element for verification. Basically, it is the document that will reflect the results of the monitoring and calculations, and it will be subject to verification. And there is two types or three types of reports. You have the full emission report, which is basically what is going to be verified. It covers all the results of the monitoring plan and calculation. So it's actually very, very comprehensive. You will have seen it in the methodology implementing regulation. Then there is the summary emission report for installation operators registered in the CBAM registry that would be available to users of the goods, authorized CBAM declarants, and where relevant operators using the goods as precursors. And then there is a declarant-specific addendum for electricity when actual emissions are used. And this will be the last slide of the presentation, and I pass the floor to my colleague, Sofia.
Well, thank you so much to all my colleagues who gave this very exhaustive presentation. We know the methodology is very complex, so we really hope that it helped to better understand the topic. We also hope that you still have a bit of energy to bear with us so that we can move to the questions and answers section. As mentioned at the beginning, we have tried to identify the most common and relevant topics in the scope of this webinar. Actually, the vast majority of them had already been used to target a bit the presentation that you have just seen, but we thought it'd be useful to just directly mention some aspects that would deserve a last word at the end of the presentation. So we can move to the first questions, and I will turn back to our first speaker, Ivana, for the first question that we have. So, how should we calculate embedded emissions if we purchased a part of the material from a supplier who provided emission data, but they are not verified? Can we use them?
Thank you, Sophie. This is a very relevant question of the verification and actual data in precursors. And what I said in the beginning, the mapping of your supplier chain and active communication with your suppliers, if they are suppliers of CBAM goods, is essential. And we really encourage you to do that. In that particular example, is that it seems that there are actual emission data not verified. There is a small step or maybe big one to have a verification report, but it would be really worth it. Why so? Because in the absence of verification report, unfortunately, the default value should be used. However, if you know and you can demonstrate, as Julie said, the country where the precursors or was produced, who your supplier is, then you can use the default values for that specific country, and they appear in Annex 1 to Implementing Act on Default Values. If, unfortunately, the origin of the precursor is not known, then you need to use default values in Annex 4 that are more punitive. So I hope that it's quite exhaustive. Plus, in the part of the question, it says part of the material. So please don't forget to consider the calculation of weighted average as well. And especially if that supplier is really a supplier of a, let's say, CO2 intensive good, the more incentive for you it is to approach and start negotiating for arrangement of the verification report already now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ivana. And I would have another question to ask you. Is it possible to share verified emissions with importers while keeping the producer's identification as trade secret?
Oh, interesting question, Sophie. I think that we get a lot because emission data, they are quite sensitive, and they are really considered sometimes trade secret. Like there's a now completely new currency, this carbon accounting, that is emerging. So yeah, that's a relevant question. And the CBAM registry, as I mentioned in the beginning, does have a functionality that the operators can share their emission data only with selected importers. However, when they share this data, automatically there is a name of the operator, the installation identification, to really enable the proof that the emissions are real and actually were included in that installation. So it is not possible to completely, let's say, hide the identity of a supplier or producer. Hope that answers the question. Thank you.
It definitely does. Thank you so much, Ivana. And thank you so much for having been with us today. And we can move to the next question, going back to Rocio, actually. So, does the EU ETS exemption for an EU-based installation also apply to such an installation under CBAM? In particular, is the exception in the ETS of installations whose total rated thermal input is below 20 megawatt also valid for CBAM?
This is actually a question that we think is very important and worth to explain. Well, the issue with CBAM and EU ETS is that CBAM is a product-based instrument, while the EU ETS is based at installation level. So the alignment of both methodologies in terms of system boundaries is quite challenging, since this threshold of 20 megawatts that applies to EU ETS cannot be evaluated ex ante for the purpose of CBAM compliance. CBAM applies to products and processes, so not to installations, and so we have to define the methodology based on products and processes, as I have explained. But we have tried to minimize this case. So we have selected the processes in the system boundaries of iron and steel products because this is an issue from this sector, based on first if the process is covered by activities under the ETS subject to phase out of free allocation. In this criteria, we have taken into account that there is an activity in the UETS that is production or processing of ferrous metals, which includes these processes that you may have seen in the methodology already or similar. This processing includes rolling mills, reheaters, annealing, smitheries, foundries, coating, and pickling. So this was one of the criteria, whether the process could be, let's say, within this activity. And then within those processes, we chose from the transitional methodology. You remember there was a list of processes for iron and steel products and aluminum products. So we assessed this list of processes, taking into account whether they were very energy consuming, if they were using fuels and therefore they had some significant direct emissions. Based on these two criteria, we selected the system boundaries in a way that, okay, it may happen that small installations may be still that would not be in the UETS are still covered by CBAM. Yes, this is a possibility, but we think that we have minimized this a lot, and also be also aware that the verification will have a materiality level that the verifier will take into account in case that these processes are not so significant in terms of embedded emissions compared to the rest of processes in the system boundaries.
Great. Thank you so much, Rocio. And I'm now going to turn back to Julie for a question to her. Is it possible to calculate the specific embedded emissions just for EU production lots by production route, by precursors used, instead of using a weighted average per CN code?
Thank you, Sophia. So, as you explained earlier, the functional unit is really the basis to compute specific embedded emissions. And this is because it's based on the function, the quality, and the performance of the CBAM goods. So then we saw that production processes are defined per functional unit and therefore per CN code, except for the multifunctional processes where several functional units can be combined in one production process. But in any case, there can never be more than one production process per functional unit. This is because then you would split the production of a functional unit based on arbitrary choices such as the destination, the production route, etc., and not linked with the quality attributes of the good. So as a consequence, the answer to this question is no. Specific embedded emission cannot be calculated just for EU production lots. They cannot be calculated just by production route and also not by precursors used.
Thank you so much, Julie. And I think that we actually have time for another last question to Michael, so that each and every of our speakers had a little Q&A at the very end. So, Michael, is there a plan to include emissions from electricity systems of third countries into the CBAM system?
Yeah, so looking at the question, I think it's first important to have a really clear differentiation between electricity as a good and indirect emissions, because things differ also with the plans for the future for those two. So electricity as a good is of course covered by the CBAM when electricity is imported into the EU. And in that case, there are some changes that have been proposed by the Commission on 17th of December. These actually concern the methodology to calculate the embedded emissions of electricity. I won't go into much detail because time is running here, but just to say the methodology might change there a little bit. Another change would concern the conditions to declare actual emissions of electricity. And there, the goal is to make it easier to declare actual emissions. But in any event, these are proposals from December, so they're online. If you go to the CBAM webpage, you can find the links to them there. They are now being examined by the co-legislators in Council and Parliament. And so we'll have to see what they make of it. But it's always a good idea to keep an eye on our CBAM webpage, and there you can see how things move on. If there are news from the co-legislature, if things are decided, it will appear there. Now, for indirect emissions, this is a different case, of course, because here we're talking about a CBAM good that is being imported into the EU, and the indirect emissions are the ones from the electricity that is consumed to produce those goods. And those we've looked at previously in the webinar. So these are included in the CBAM for CBAM goods, not in Annex 2. There are some changes between the transition and definitive period that we've also looked at. But just to mention maybe that the Commission will also review the indirect emissions coverage of the CBAM in the future, and will also do that a bit in coordination with, for instance, state aid guidelines, etc. So these things are still coming up, but just to give you a bit of an idea about electricity versus indirect emissions and plans for the future.
Thank you so much, Michael, and thank you all for having been here with us today. Before passing the floor to Astrid for the closing remarks, I'd like to highlight that you can find some useful links at the end of the presentation, so please consult it as soon as available. Astrid, please.
Thank you very much, Sophia, and thank you very much to all my colleagues for their very useful and comprehensive contribution to a better understanding of the various topics we cover today. We hope that you have found this information useful, that it has helped you first to better understand why the methodology to calculate embedded emission based on actual values is important, and how you can prepare to use actual values. And then second, to also understand some key aspects of the CBAM methodology. In a nutshell and in a wrap up, as we have already gone exhaustively around various topics, but good to flag the main changes that are in the methodology as compared to the one from the transitional period, with first the introduction of the concept of functional unit, which is to be used as reference to calculate embedded emission, production process that have to be defined by functional unit, the new rules to set up multifunctional production processes, the new system boundaries for iron and steel products and aluminium products, the new rules to calculate embedded emissions of precursors, and finally a list of elements to include in the monitoring plan and the operator's emissions report document that will be used as a basis for verification. So this was in a nutshell the various topics that we have discussed. As already announced, but it's always good to remind it, a more technical, detailed, and comprehensive guidance will be provided in the guidance documents for non-EU operators, which will be published soon and will allow all of you, of course, to have a read-through of all those elements in more details. As mentioned earlier on, but again, I think it is useful to remind it, the key takeaways, the recording of this webinar will be available on our website. And please remember to subscribe to the CBAM newsletter to receive updates on upcoming webinars and information on the latest CBAM news. So with this, I think we have nicely managed to cover all the planned ground within the allocated time frame. Many thanks to all of you for having joined us today, and we will certainly see you in upcoming webinars. Bye.